I don't know how you all made sense of the news stories that came to us day after day this week. But I have to tell you, each day I was moved to a different emotion. Sadness, shock, horror, dismay, all of the above, you know? Just to make sure we're kind of all on the same page. So, Tuesday in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, a 37-year-old man by the name of Alton Sterling, an African-American man, was shot and killed by 2 police officers. They had responded to a report that there was an individual selling CDs in front of a convenience store. On Wednesday, a 32-year-old man by the name of Fernando Castillo in suburban St. Paul, Minnesota, was pulled over for a traffic stop, shot 4 times, and he died 20 minutes later at the nearby hospital. He was African American too. The governor of Minnesota went on the news the next day and admitted, he said, you know, I believe if this man had been white, he would not have died. And then on Thursday, as there's a basically peaceful protest from all accounts in Dallas, a Black Lives Matter protest, a sniper shoots 5 police officers, killing them, and wounds 7 others. What a series of days we have had in this country. And I have to say, and as I sat down to sort of reflect on the gospel that we just heard, I thought to myself, you know, we in this country, we've been a bit like the passers-by in this story of the Good Samaritan, passing by people who have been mortally wounded. And the question is, how are we going to respond? Are we going to respond like the Levite and like the priest and keep going? Are we going to respond like the Samaritan and stop and try to make a difference? So if you've been in church more than once or twice, you've probably heard the parable of the Good Samaritan. It starts as the lawyer is putting Jesus to the test. Perhaps the origin of all lawyer jokes, right? My apologies to anyone who's a lawyer around here. He puts Jesus to the test, and he says, so what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus goes to the very law that this man practices. He says, well, what does the law say? Well, the guy knows his law. He knows the answer to his question. In fact, he says, well, to love the Lord, my God, with all my heart, with all my soul, with all my strength, with all my mind, with all my body. Jesus is like, right, you got it. But the guy wants to justify himself a little bit. Oh, and by the way, sorry, I left out the last part, right? And to love my neighbor as myself. Whoops, Freudian slip that one, huh? But the guy wants to justify himself to kind of prove that he's really above reproach and on firm ground. So he says to Jesus, he says, so who is my neighbor? And Jesus gives him the story. There's a man, Jesus said, who's making the journey from Jerusalem to Jericho. Let me just stop right there and say that Jesus doesn't identify the man in any other way, right? He doesn't say that the man's a rich man or a poor man. He doesn't say that the man is a Jew or a Gentile. He doesn't say that the man is of some great standing or of little-known office. He doesn't say anything. He's just a man. wants us to understand that this could be any man or woman, anyone. But there's someone who's traveling. And he gets ambushed by a bunch of robbers who beat him and rob him, strip him of all his money, strip him of his clothes, strip him of his dignity. And they leave the man there in the streets, half dead, Jesus said. Then the passers-by begin. The priest comes by, sees the man, passes to the other side. I want to look. A Levite comes by, sees the man, passes to the other side. I don't want to touch. Now, some people have argued, well, but wait a sec. These were faithful individuals who understand the purity laws, and they couldn't touch him because he might have been unclean. And yet what I want to say to you is, nah, not so fast. Wait a second. Because, yeah, there are the purity laws, but laws even more important than the purity laws commanded faithful Jews, if they saw someone who was injured, to tend to them. And perhaps one of the highest good deeds, one of the greatest mitzvahs that a Jew could do was to bury a dead. Because there was no reward that they could receive monetarily. And so this priest, this Levite, they knew those commandments. They could have looked in to see what was going on with the man. They could have buried him. They didn't, and they didn't because they just didn't want to stop. They just didn't want to get involved. Can you imagine being that guy laying on the ground? Maybe beaten so badly that you can't barely move. But you hear the footsteps approaching, and you think, I'm going to be saved. And then you hear the footsteps moving away. Not a word spoken, not a touch offered. But there's a third passerby, right? A third traveler. This is Samaritan. And you heard me maybe a couple weeks ago talk about how the irony of Samaritans is that the relationship between Jews and Samaritans was so strained. It was filled with nothing but animosity. They wanted to avoid each other at all costs. Here a Samaritan comes by, and the Samaritan stops. The Samaritan doesn't pass over to the other side, right? The Samaritan goes and he checks the man out. He's still alive. And then the most amazing thing happens. We hear that finding him alive, the Samaritan is filled with pity. The Samaritan tends to his wounds. He pours some of his oil and his wine on this man to bandage his wounds. He gives up some of his real treasures, his resources, to care for this man. He puts them on his animal. He takes them to an inn where he can receive even still further care. He tends to him overnight. And before he leaves the next day, he says to the innkeeper, here's 2 denarii. Take care of him. And I'll be back to check in and to pay whatever other expenses there might be. What an amazing response from this guy who was supposed to be hated, who was supposed to be so unworthy as to be avoided at all costs. Well, Jesus says to the lawyer, so, who is the neighbor here? And the lawyer knows the answer, the Samaritan. Jesus said, go and do likewise. You can only imagine the lawyer's feelings as he's sort of skulked away. Go and do likewise. That's his answer to the lawyer. That's his challenge to you and me too. Do likewise. Now, it's clear, if not simple. Do likewise. Of course, what's hard to put meat on these bones is, well, so what does likewise look like? What does that mean? And if the story tells us anything, then it means, first of all, we got to stop. We got to stop in our tracks. This Samaritan, he had a trip to make. He was traveling too. He had a schedule to keep. He had an errand to run. Who knows what was going on? But he stopped. We got to stop in our tracks what we're doing. And then we gotta come near. The Samaritan across the street came near to the man to see him, to find him, to discover what sort of condition he was in, what need he had. Come near. And then open up our hearts. I don't think it's a throwaway to hear that the Samaritan was moved to pity. The Samaritan gave this stranger his heart. And then he gave him more. Of course, he gave him some of his resources. He made a bit of a sacrifice with his animal, with his wine, with his oil, that he would have planned to use and keep for himself. But he gave some of what he had to the stranger. And he promised to come back, to make sure that he was healed. Go into my heart. So look, I'm not exactly sure how to be a neighbor after the kind of week that we have had. But I think for sure it means that we've got to stop our regularly scheduled programming. We've got to stop, we've got to pay attention. We've got to watch. We've got to listen. We've got to listen to the moaning and to the groaning and to the pains that all those who are wounded or who are grieving are letting loose. As much as I want to turn the TV channel, I feel like I owe it to these people to listen, to learn. We can't learn unless we come near, you know? We can't know someone's story unless we approach them. We've got to learn the stories of these people, these travelers. They're not just black or white or blue, but they are individuals. They are any man or woman or child who have hopes, who have needs, who are sometimes decent and sometimes less so. We've got to know these people as our neighbors. And that will make a difference. We've got to open our hearts. Open our hearts to feel what they're feeling. Did you see the news interview of that woman and her 15-year-old son dissolving into tears? Or did you hear about the daughter, the 4-year-old daughter of the woman in Minneapolis who tried to console her mother? The mother was so poised, but finally breaking down. We've got to make sure that our hearts are open to these people. Just like they should be open to the people in Dallas. The now widow whose new husband was shot and killed. All of these people, our hearts need to be open to them. We've got to put some skin in the game. We've got to be willing to do something, to take some action, to give up a little bit of what we have to make a difference. And we've got to know, and this is so important, I think, in this day and age, when things have just a news cycle. This is not a news cycle. This is not a moment. We've got to be willing to come back to this. Just like the Samaritan was willing to come back to the innkeeper, we've got to be willing to come back to this because this country is not going to be healed overnight. I don't have many answers just yet, but we've got to be willing to keep at the conversation, to keep paying attention, to keep listening, to keep crossing the street, to stop what is familiar and comfortable and planned, and to see if we can make a difference. Because to be indifferent, to be silent, is to participate in the horror of it all. It's so easy to listen to this story and be appalled by the priest and the Levite. I don't want to be like the priest or the Levite as I listen to the stories that we hear on our news. I want to go and do like that. Martin Luther King once wrote, "Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter." Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. I'd like to believe that the opposite can be true too, which is that our lives really begin the day we speak out about the things that matter most.